Thank you very much. So this works, I will present, I'll cover what I can cover by the time that has been given to me. It's a collaboration. In yellow, you see the ones who contribute more with what I say. And I have to say that I'm extremely honored to be here. I always thought that this conference is the best intellectual reward per dollar existing in the world. And so far, it has been that way even this year. I was looking at the conference, and if I understand well, these are all the conferences that have been given, and this is the 15th anniversary of this conference. And then it's an incredible kind of achievement that speaks to the ones who founded this group here and to the ones who actually are coming afterward. And so happy birthday for this conference. Don't count the candles because they are not correct, because this is artificial intelligence generated picture, and they don't know how to count the candles. So one of the things which is incredible about this conference is that actually it is the program is set by the students. The students, if I remember, they vote and they decide who is coming. And that gave me the idea of make my plan. And so some years ago, I started sending and receiving people from here. And when I felt that I had a sizable relative majority of the students, I asked my hidden cells to strike, and that's why I'm here. They voted for me. So thank you for all of those who contributed to it. What I want to do is to focus on a problem, which is this one. I think we are all for evolution. We are all for comparative cognition, but we also know that we are different from the other living beings. And the question is why? We can go back to whenever you want, but if you think about the achievement of humanity, they are really impressive. All over the place you find them, from the most complicated ones to the simplest one that we use every day, and we don't even know who invented, like the sink of a faucet. And if you go back, you find these drawings that are showing a lot of sophistication and a lot of symbolic ability. The same kind of sophistication, symbolic ability that you find in children when they start their own drawings. And you find, but not exactly that way, when you use an artificial intelligence system. This is a Santa Claus drawn by ChatGPT as a 3-month-old infant would make it. Yeah. Okay, so the question here is, so there is a difference between our intelligence, the intelligence of other animals, and the intelligence that we are able to capture artificially. So what makes us so different from our other living beings? And there are many, many reasons which have been given. Let me focus on one, which is this idea that is natural language. I guess that one of the reasons why this became so popular as an idea is that it comes from the Chomsky-Hauser original article, which said, okay, humans have something that other animals don't have, which is what they were calling the faculty of language in the narrow sense, which is a compositional system, essentially a recursive system that we have and other people do not have it. This theory has been superpowered by many, many people, including many who are here in this room. So you can find lots of quotes. I picked randomly 2 or 3, which says essentially that humans are different from other animals because this ability to put together cognition comes only when linguistic material comes. I believe that the one who was right was Professor Schwarzman, when he noticed that the first inventor of the decodification of the language of dogs and found out what dogs were able to say is this one. Simply, they cannot say much. So the point is not just about language, it's about what you think about language. So what we are working on is to add something which we call thinking, a certain set of internal languages, the language of thought as it is being called, which by its own properties should be able to explain a little part of this human singularity, which nobody will be able to explain in this century and maybe the next century and maybe the next century yet, but we are working on it. So thinking is added to the picture, and then the point is that thinking is thinking about many, many different things, and so we expect that thinking about the world, so, having like what is called the core physical knowledge, is not necessarily thinking about other, is not necessarily thinking about oneself, which is another of these areas that people have developed recently. Azzurra, who is here, Isabelle Dutriche, Laura Schultz, they did wonderful work showing that not only is there a language of thought, there is one, but there is also a meta-language of thought, ability to think about oneself. This doesn't mean that we get them right. So this is, for example, a self-evaluation of abilities that we might not necessarily think that we want to subscribe to. Okay, now I want to focus on one issue which is not coming from my research. It's thinking about sequences, so a very specific one, because my aim today is to show you that there are ingredients in the solution to this problem, the proposed solution, that come up in different forms with my own research, and they might give an idea of how to actually look for the development of a typically human language of thought. Okay, this is work that comes from the Standean lab. This is Fosca Rumi paper, and it's very simple. Look at these dots and imagine that I say, okay, do this and continue. I think that it's immediate to know how to continue, or else do this and continue, okay? Or else do this and continue. This is quite a little more complicated, but the point is it's a very immediate to know how to continue. And what Fosca and her collaborator did, they tried to make a geometrical grammar for this language of thought, which contains a set of primitives and a set of operation over primitives that explain why we are so able to generate this kind of solutions immediately. The important part of this is that you can also decode what the brain is doing when this projection of shapes is being done. So if you imagine that this is the sequence, and so if you do the sequence in 1, 2, 3, so first position, 1, second position, 2, and so on, or this one, first position, 1, second position would be this one, so it should be here. And then you do a decoding on the MEG signal of the participants, adults who are looking at this code, you find something very similar to the predicted sequence. And you can actually show very precise in time with these techniques what moment and and which areas are involved when you predict what the next position is. And this works surprisingly well. There is another set of research which goes in the sort of the same direction, and this is the one that also Barbara Pomichowska talked about. It is work by Matthias Sablemeyer and his collaborator, and the idea is, okay, spot the one which is not the one that you that is coming out from this, and among these two, the answer is this one. This is not the right one, and then you can do the same by presenting a lot of much more complex shapes. And what Matthias and colleagues did is they generated, once again, a sort of a grammar that starts with some primitives which are extremely simple form, and then there is a program that put them together. And then what they did is they looked at errors that people make when they actually see which shape is the odd one. And the important thing here is that if you look at humans, there are shapes for which there is really no error, and shapes for which there is a considerable amount of errors. They compare this with baboons, and baboons can do this task. They can be trained, and you see that there is a training effect because the errors go down with the different iteration of the task. But there is no single shape that pops out as immediate to baboons. And if you then compare these with some sort of neural network, in this case convolutional neural network, and you see which system predicts better the results, a system that is based on basically very low-level extraction of information, or a system that goes by generation from a language. You can see that a system that uses convolutional network predicts very well what baboons do, but very poorly what humans do. By contrast, the language that they proposed predicts very well what humans do, but baboons don't do. So all of these seems to suggest that there is something special to humans in doing this kind of operation. Now, you can do these operations not only on visual, but also on auditory sequences and many others. And it turns out that the same explanation exists. And now the question is why? And in looking for why, the same group has made this proposal which interacts with mine, and that's why I wanted to present it here. And the idea is the following. You have the standard kind of result that you could expect for subitizing, but if you do some subitizing experiment where you have some grouping kind of criterion, what you find are this kind of plateau which seems to be subitizing for groups, and that's why they call it groupitizing. It's not quite chunking, but it's similar to some sort of chunking procedure. And in order to make sense of this idea that we can group and do things with small sets in a very efficient way, they proposed what they call the syntax of set language of thought, okay? And set is important here. So on the one hand, you have this language, something which you are used to when we think about the language of thought, like primitives, rules of composition, and this idea that some metrics on the complexity of the program is really giving us the response of adults, in this case, minimal description length. And then you need other concepts, like, for example, the concept of set, the concept of subset, and the concept of groupitizing, which is grouping in a particular way the subset. So this is a mixed kind of system by which some of the concepts we are very clear about, and some of the concepts really can be only spelled out if you know the psychology. What does it mean, groupitizing? Okay, all of this to me seems to suggest that we can conclude that human represents situations in a format that is different from the one of machines and other primates. There are local language of thought that underline this ability, and maybe there is a global set-based language of thought that is overarching these possibilities. And this comes with our question. These are not my questions, these are everybody's questions. So what there is exactly beyond local laws? How is the structure of representation? How they are realizing the brain? I don't care very much about the brain, really, but I think that here is very informative, and that's why I'm interested in it. Okay, I want to make a disclaimer. I know that there is this literature, and this literature is very problematic for the story that I want to say, but let me dream as if this literature did not exist. The work by Redshaw and Southendorf that shows egregious mistakes in understanding something that should be simpler. The work of Lee Hyens and his collaborators that show that children really don't seem to understand the difference between possible and necessary. The work of Jean Remy that we heard about yesterday that thinks that even younger infants are unable to be trained to something that you should be able to be trained if you have some sort of logical apparatus. Let's put it aside for a moment. I need to give an explanation sooner or later of this, but so do I hope these people need to give an explanation for what I'm going to say. Okay, let's be simple. Let's talk about what I think about a representation. A representation is basically a sentence in some sort of language that can be mapped onto reality. It can be true or false. And the nice thing about representation, at least in natural language, is that they are connected by entailment relation. Very simply, if I have John likes Mary or Carl, and John doesn't like Mary, then I can have two things here. One is I have certain logical representation that use some sort of structure that involves some logical items. And from this, by rules, we can make an inference. And the standard idea that we have been trying to work on, and it's really coming from lack of fantasy, is to take these parts and come up from logical primitives from there and some rules of composition. I think this is correct, but it's not the whole story. Even if it were the whole story, we can start for these kind of things, but I want to just make the point that there is a lot of logicality in language, so that if you take away all what is logic in language, you remain with sentences like good, good, food, like, home, and not much more than that. So this is a tip of the iceberg that I'm going to talk about. So what did we do? We spent a lot, and I'm going to present some data that refer to possible representation of a disjunction and maybe possible representation of quantifiers. We take something that we have reasons to believe to be a well-worked and important kind of reasoning schema, and this reasoning schema has some sort of part that we call representational form, like whatever form it is, this one, and then from this one, another part which is the inference form. From this representation you can derive an inference. And our job has been trying to make this become close to something that we can present without having language at all and see what happens. And let me show you what we did with the OR, our first idea. The idea is always to be to present different kinds of objects of different categories that are very different from each other, except that when they are hidden, you cannot distinguish one from the other. We want to really generate an unknown representation in infants or in adults. Now, this is something that has been presented from a long time ago, and you can think, okay, he went and he moved on to other things. And no, we actually continued in a very obsessive way to explore this kind of paradigm. And when I mean obsessive, I really mean obsessive. So this is basically part of the material that my students had to create to do this kind of experiments. But the basic idea, and I think it's important to do it because there is something to be gathered from this. And as the young group worked on some very simple case, which is the geometrical case, so I think we have a lot of there is a lot of mileage they can do by really focusing obsessively on this kind of paradigm. So the idea is the following. You start with something like two objects, and then in a certain position, in a certain moment, one object disappears, and now you cannot distinguish it. And here we use naive logic. It's important, sorry, naive theory of the world. We use containment relations because we know that containment relations are parsed automatically, let's put it that way. It's important that there are many differences if you change this paradigm. Then in other conditions, they're very similar, but you know what object is inside this cup. That's the basic context. And we call it the logical representation, and I'm talking about it later, because you can imagine that in one condition this is unknown, or this is it's an A or a B, whichever you prefer for the moment. And then we continue the scene with a disambiguating scene, so that if you come from this representation, you can derive from inference, because you have seen that the snake is here, then you should be able to know what object is inside. Whereas if you derive from this part of the scene, you already know what object is inside the cup, you don't care. No? And so we call this the inference phase. And what we have been trying to do is to gather evidence, behavioral and neural evidence of what happens in these two moments that are very fast and they go fly away. And the procedure that we mostly used is oculomotor data, and what I'm going to show you is what happens in the pupil of an infant and of an adult when you present this thing that we call the logical representation, the unknown, potential unknown representation. And what we found consistently in several experiments is that both adults and infants have a pupil that, these are normalized data of pupil dilation, they have a pupil that remains more dilated when you are seeing something that you don't, whose identity you do not know. And then there is this moment, the inference phase, when you can draw an inference, and I insist these are very fast events, and we still find that in this moment, again, the pupil of an infant of 12 months old and an adult is more dilated when there is work to be done to draw an inference. We tried to map this onto the brain representation of these things. Why so? Well, because the point about whether these kind of processes are perceptual or, let's say, conceptual can be also read by, okay, what kind of areas are you involved in when you do this kind of operation? Is it only visual? Do you really need of your brain? And so this, what you see here, this work by Ana Martín Salguero and colleagues, you see what happens at the logical representation, and there is a wide set of areas which are active. This is fMRI data for adults, which are active when you know what object is inside the cup, but there is a very tiny network, in particular this prefrontal area, BA10, which codes the moment when you don't know what object is inside the cup. And then, at the moment of the inference, these networks reorganize itself very quickly, and you find that when you can derive what object is inside the cup, then you have this frontoparietal network that gets activated for the inference phase, and again, a wide areas that are activated in the phase which you don't care about the inference. And importantly, these areas do not overlap with linguistic areas, but they might overlap with other areas. There are two kinds of networks which have been very well described, at least from the point of view of the signal that they generate, not much from the point of view of what they do. One is the default mode network, essentially the network that is active when you do nothing, to make it simple, and the multiple demand network, essentially the network which is active when you have to do something. And by the description itself, you realize that we are still at the primitive stage of understanding what these things do. So the question is, how do we have a new network that has to do with logic, or do we really simply represent what has been already presented by many other articles about these two networks? So what we did, we took the areas that correspond to the default mode network or to the multiple demand network, and we tried to map which kinds of areas you would expect to be active if the reduction that I gave you before have to do with the default mode network, or which are unexpected, both for the DMN and the MDN. And what you can see here is that many of the areas that we know to be active in the two networks are not active, and by contrast, many of the areas that we would not expect to be active are active in both cases. So what I think we are after is a network which has to do with reasoning, maybe logical reasoning, we don't go that far, but with reasoning as opposed to what you find described so far in the literature. And we try to also do this work with infants by using optical topography. So these are 12-month-old infants. These are going to work by Martin Salguero with Judith Gervain and other people. And this is where the probes were put, so that this is the position. And then the question is, what happens here when infants see these scenes? We cannot distinguish the two moments, but scenes with logical valence as opposed to things that have no logical information. And you see that there is a bilateral network which is active, which is, again, very consistent with what we found in the adult brain, except that it is bilateral. So there might be something that has to do with language that changes the way in which this information is treated, but it doesn't involve areas that we know are active in language processing in infants at that age. Okay? So now the question is, to what extent is this dependent on our own paradigm, or is it general? It could be something that has to do with how we parse visual scene. So what we showed, this is work by Kinga Bowes, that if you have this paradigm...
¿Cuál es la doti?
So you have a novel word, and you could imagine
La doti.
to solve the problem of novel word learning by simply mapping novel to novel, right? This is a strategy. Work by Justin Alberta some years ago showed that, in fact, that's not what happened. These are both with the adults and with 3-year-old children. And if you look at where kids or adults are looking for at the beginning of the trial, before you say the magic word, let's put it that way, you could see that there is this deflection. So you are looking at the unknown object. You hear the word doti, which is unknown. You have nothing to do but stay in there. But in fact, that's not what people do. They go back to the other object, whose word they know, and they go in back to the target, which they don't do when the object is known. So the idea here that has been proposed by Justin is that this kind of double checking is a sign of exclusionary reasoning. So what we did, we tried to find if there is any exclusionary reasoning in infants. These are 19-month-old infants. And you see that we have two measures here. One is this, say, proportion of looking starting from the target to the object or not. You see that if you know the word, you just don't do anything. But if you do not know the word, you just go back towards this one and go back here. And if you look at the proportion of trials which have double checks in the unknown condition, unknown target initial condition or the known, you see that there are more double checks in the unknown. And interestingly, what we found, so we have the same declination of signal. Interesting, we find also that infants at this age do also when they know both words. Know here is a big word, we want to discuss. So what we think is happening is that at this age, when you have a lexical system that you are building, 19 months, but is not already integrated in something completely automatic, you rely on reasoning even more than adults. You just do it when you don't need it. You don't really know exactly whether this is a spoon or whether this is a cookie, and then you double check more than what you would do. So if anything, reasoning is used in this kind of tasks more to learn language rather than language being used to found reasoning. We tried to push down this work by using a result that has been found some years ago by Barbara Pomichowska and her colleagues. And this is the idea that if you give ostensive cues, even infants that generally fail mutual exclusivity task, they succeed. So we did this. How do we control that a 12-month-old knows words? Well, very complicated. What we did, we gave a booklet to the mothers or to the families, and they kept this booklet at home for at least 15 days, more than that. This was my most successful scientific enterprise. The booklet was a great success. We had kids who came back and had to cry when they had to give it back, so they really are very involved. And in these books, there are some of the items that we present.
Hola, petit!
Oops, sorry, this is not...
On és el biberó?
So we induce...
El biberó!
Sorry. We induce ostensive cues in this way. There is a poster by Francesca Kummer and colleagues that is being presented. And then we test kids with the normal either mutual exclusivity or non-known kind of trials. And what we found, so these are the data of Bochush a few years ago, and these are data that are still ongoing. And the important thing here to see is that these are more than 16, closer to this age. You see the same sort of deflection. We still not require a lot of data. And you still see the same prevalence of double checks in trials where infants are looking at the unknown before, suggesting, again, a checking procedure. And we sort of find the same thing, at least in terms of the number of trials with double checking in infants, in 13-month-old infants. We are collecting this data, but we think that it's possible to push down results to this age. Okay, this is one of the results that suggests that deduction is not just used for coding where objects are. You can use it for knowing what words are, but other work that has been done by Nicolò Cesana-Lotti, Agnes Gerno Teglascier, they have shown that in fact you can use these kind of procedures when you need to work on intentions, and even when you use something that is induced in the physical domain, and then you test the intentional domain. And maybe it's also used in an abstract way. There was a poster yesterday by directly working on types of objects as opposed to single object and move on screen. Okay, so I think that the evidence so far suggests that these are cross-modal kind of templates. They are certainly cross-core knowledge domains, and they are also cross-task. So it's very difficult to define them as something that you find inside one of the early knowledge domains that have been described in the literature. Okay, I want to just say something about another case which has to do with all and some, and that requires a little more work, so I hope to be able to do it. And here we are switching on adults because we need first to just get clear on what happens in adults. The point is we want to induce people in a state of not knowing, a state of ambiguity about the reference. Why? Because I think that we are not just a predictive machine. The brain is not just a predictive machine. We predict the next future state of affairs. That's okay. But what makes us different from other animals is that when you cannot predict, you have a lot of things that you can do if you think about hypotheses and possible states of the world and so on and so on. So we try to force an unknown representation, but of course this is also in itself very ambiguous. It's ambiguous because it could be, as it has been described by other people in this room, maybe A, maybe B kind of representation, or some unspecified X, so a variable with a quantifier, or a disjunction, or maybe none of the above. It's just simple a reaction about you betting which object is inside this cup. And there is another element of ambiguity that I think it has not been looked at, and the unknown is also different according to whether it starts from something that you know, like a snake and an umbrella, or from something that you don't know. So there is a double ambiguity on the notion of unknown. And we have to try, or else maybe between many alternatives. We don't know. We really don't have the literature here. And so we try to address this in this way. This is work that is being currently done to prepare material for doing magnetoencephalography experiment on adults. And the task changes, but not the logic. It's important that the task changes because here we don't use containment relation any longer. And that makes all of these things even more ambiguous and very arbitrary. So the point here is you need to know what object is to the left of the card. We need to instruct participants to do that, okay? And then you see two known alternatives, and then objects move around, and then you need to know what is on the left. Okay, that is an unknown among two known alternatives. And you can do the same by simply starting with cards turned on the other side. So now you don't know what there is, and now you don't know what there is about unknown things. And we have found some data that suggests that the representation of the unknown is very complex and unexpected in a certain way. So suppose that now I can compare what you can put in memory with what you cannot. So in these cases, you always put in memory something. You put two slots, but you don't have the identity here, no? So what happens when you have to represent the unknown and you know what objects were there, right? So in one case, this is the case, two objects you know, then you have to, okay, it's the flower, good, done, okay? Nothing that checking that one of the objects there. Whereas here, you see these and say, oh, I don't know what object is in there. So you could imagine, as I showed you before, that there is higher pupil dilation because in this case, you don't know what object is here, but when you see this one, you're going to know what object is here. So, and this is actually what we found. This is pupil dilation. This is sort of the same result as before. The unknown representation has a cost in this case, which is understandable. But now suppose that you start from two unknown objects, right? So you have to say what card is on the left. You start with two unknown, okay? And then you see this one, okay, it's a flower, task done, okay? What card is on the left? You start from two unknown. It's this one, task done too, because no matter what is appearing to the right, it's not going to tell you what's on the left, okay? Very well. So what we were expecting is that when you have to update memory, that would cost more than actually adding and maintaining an unknown representation. And in fact, we found exactly the opposite. Maintaining an unknown representation is more costly no matter what, okay? So there must be some processing that is connected to this. And then there is another ambiguity that has to do with how do we know? We started with a very simple case, two objects. Let's put many objects. And the idea here is the following. If you start with three objects, you can represent them as an A or a B or a C, an A or a B or a C or a D. And then at a certain point in adults, you need to switch representation. And we wanted to capture this representation switching from a disjunction onto a representation that is something like one of those, or there is an X such that, something like going from coding this information in constants to coding it with a variable and a quantifier. So we started putting lots of objects that can be sort of living and non-living objects, and these objects move around as the same thing. And now we are interested in this moment, what does it mean to have an unknown between many, okay? And what we found is, again, this is pupil dilation, something exactly, maybe the first time that I have a prediction that is actually backed by the data. So these are all the cases in which you know what object is inside. So, and there is no distinction between them. And the important thing is the red lines. And here are the cases when you have one, two, or three, or four objects, okay? Now, you have this pupil dilation that is higher than the known. But the important fact is that when you have many objects, so you cannot track them, you have a pupil dilation that is still higher than baseline, but lower than the representation of single objects. And this corresponds, I think, to this idea that when you, this is why logic is for. You are there, when you cannot code objects individually, you just represent them with a sentence that covers a domain that could be potentially infinite. It costs less than representing the single disjunction or conjunction. And that's what we found. And we tried to cross this with this idea of groupitizing. So we first induced a very clear group by reason that you can imagine, faces and houses, and we did the same kind of task, slightly different. Here we go back to the containment relation, okay? This would be an unknown among two categories, two groups that we know. And so sometimes we induce groupitizing, and sometimes we inhibit groupitizing by putting objects that come from all different categories. And what we found is that when we induce groupitizing, we find exactly the same result as before. So if you are above subitizing, you have a pupil dilation which is lower than when you are below subitizing because you are trying to code the individual objects one by one. But when you inhibit this groupitizing, then the two completely reverse. And you find that the below subitizing now is down, and the above subitizing is up, right? Suggesting that in this kind of situation, participants try still to represent objects one by one because they don't have the help of the groupitizing. So we find the same kind of sort of conceptual tools that I have presented, that the group of Stanislas Dehaene presented for the geometrical case. We need to find maybe a language which has the same kind of thing that we are all used to, primitives, constant variables, but also some information about sets and how sets can be easily represented in memory by humans. Yeah. Now, I need to just represent something which is even more complex. I hope to be able to do it, but I think it's quite important. Some or in language, natural language, have this property that they are ambiguous themselves. And it is known that they have what is called the logical meaning. So, for example, A or B or both. Some maybe also it's compatible with all. But there is also what is called an enriched meaning, in which when I say to you, you know, this world is too small for us, either you or me, I really mean one of the two is going to be killed, okay? And the standard story is that it's pragmatics that determine which interpretation is correct. We believe that the standard story is not saying what really happens, and this is work by Gennaro Chierca and other people that notice that there is a distribution of words that makes them impossible in certain positions. So you can say, if anybody comes, I will be lucky. But you cannot answer to this, say, you're lucky, anybody comes. This is ungrammatical. And you can see that there are many, many words that work in this way. At all, you can say, I don't like this talk at all, but you cannot say, yeah, I like this talk at all. And so on, a little, ever, never, they all work in this way. These are items that are called negative polarity items. So they really fit well in positions like negation inside, or else in the antecedent of a conditional that for us is important. But the point about this is that, again, if you look at the logical system that we know, the one that you read in Logic 101, there is no such thing as any logical manual. There is no things like a quantifier that can only appear in a position. If a quantifier is there, it appears, otherwise it cannot appear. And so there is something that this word signal that might signal something about the meaning of this word and this signal in the grammar, but maybe in general. So, for example, and this actually, when you look at semantics, it's again explained as patterns of entailment over set. Now, let's look at the machinery that we need to understand this kind of situation. So, if somebody comes, I will be lucky, or if I'm lucky, somebody will come. Now, I trust what people tell me from the literature of semantics. When you have a quantifier in the consequent of a conditional, you tend to represent it like an exclusive quantifier, okay? Because otherwise I would have said everybody came, okay? But if you have it in the antecedent of a conditional, you tend to represent it as something that is compatible with the all, okay? So there is this switch, and once again, that switch is dependent on structural forms, not on pragmatics. And the way to explain this in semantics is that to say that there are certain operators that act over set, that are this silent only, that apply to certain position in a sentence, but not to other position in a sentence. And if you look at the machinery that you need this kind of machinery. You have scalar implicatures. I give you these words. This is something that I find fascinating in humans. You can make scales on everything and very quickly. So I can represent this in scale, and the scale is organized in set inclusion relations. And then you can do it with quantifiers. You can do it with disjunctions, so A and B, only A, only B, or I or B but not both, A or B or both. You can just represent the scales from the more informative to the less informative one. And you can do it with everything. So we are going to do shopping, and you can quickly determine the rate of these, the relative position of these predicates of a language. And then you have this silent only operator, which actually works in the following way. It closes the set to the right position. So you want one but not some, well, that's the closure operator, stop there. You want some but not few, that's the closure operation. You want few but not most, and so on. And the idea that that's what this operator does. Takes sets which are ordered and just closes where we want to stop the interpretation of these sets. And once you have this, you also have everything else. So, for example, we are in our shopping trip. We have this ordered set of predicates. I say to you, very cheap. I buy it. OK, what does it mean that I push down? But I say very expensive. I push up. But if I say almost, which is a great quantifier, almost prohibitive, Well, it's very expensive, but not quite so much that I don't do it. So these things is showing how quickly we can operate on scales. So we tried to do the same trick as before. We took a situation. This is work by Irene Canudas, who is here, and Gennaro Chierchia. We tried to transform this kind of situation in something non-verbal. And for the moment, we have data on adults. And there are many data that have been collected by Irene with Susan Carey that we need to work on. So for the moment, I only presented the I'm not claiming that this is in the baby's language. I'm claiming that this is there in the adult mind. So in this context, which we call downward entering context, there is no this operator, this only operator, the justification. And in this context, there is this operator. So that would predict that if I have able to create a situation that sort of is easily described as an implication or a causal relation to the left, I should expect to be able to accept violations of the sum and all accepted, but vice versa, if I put it to the right, that should be really very difficult. And what we did is, and we do it, and importantly, there is no language, there is no communication, there is no context, no pragmatics. If we find anything, we know that the pragmatic story is wrong, which will imply that if we want to just make a good system that explains human reasoning, adult human reasoning at least, well, we cannot rely on these conversational parts of language. Okay, that's the way we did it. We tried to use causality, so there are these little balls. These would be some small balls hit the big ball, it will explode. We put it in different position, and participants are not told what they have to do except press a button when they find the odd out. And the odd out here should be the one in which all balls touch. And if it is in the antecedent, like in this case, they shouldn't find it. They should be indifferent because if some balls touch the big ball explodes. That should be compatible with if all balls touch the big ball explodes. But if you put the same information on the consequent, so now if the big ball hits the other ball, some explode, the natural representation should be some but not all. So now the odd one out should come out in the moment in which all little balls explode. And that's what we found is that 3 different experiments always in this oddball detection paradigm. And the important thing is not important the details. The important thing is that in all cases we find that if the explosion is in the antecedent, I put it that way, people don't care about, they don't see as an oddball that all the little balls explode. But if the explosion is on the consequent, then they pull out a passage to some but not all very naturally. And now one can say, oh, but this is because the scenes are different, so who cares about all of this? And we did another thing here, and we said, okay, we on purpose use ostensive cues or like cues about animacy in this kind of situation. What happens if we take them away? We make the same scenes, but we take away the little faces, we take away this movement that shows that is some sort of intentional movement, and we ask people to judge entirely on the physical relation between these objects. So that would be a scene in which there is an explosion that only respects natural physics. Now if we do that, this effect disappears. Well, what does this suggest? This suggests that if we go naive physics all the way, instead of improving reasoning, in this kind of cases, you even inhibit it. You use other kind of, and in fact, what participants say in this case, when you have a completely naive physics setup, is, oh yes, the second ball was quite a little more to the right with respect to the first ball. So they focus on tokens and not on the general meaning of what they are seeing, the scenes one like. And after all, that's right. I mean, that's what the naive physics is for, to make predictions about what happens in the world. Yeah? And so basically, what I want to suggest here is that it is not just about pragmatics, it's not about language, it has to do with event representation, and event representation can be like correct or non-correct for this kind of phenomena according to the kind of module that you generate, not because you do reasoning with this module, but because there is a reasoning on top of it that some modular system can inhibit. All right, so that's basically where I wanted to go. We are building this idea that we can enrich the idea proposed by Deanne and colleagues that there is this syntax of sets, LOT, this is where we are, where we were before. And I think we also need to add other operations on sets, like set subset ordering, this kind of closure operation, exhaustification, and we believe that this is part of what there could be in a language of thought. And my comment here is that in infants, and even in adults, but in infants, this is a practically unexplored area. What do we know about what infants know about sets? I have in mind some few very beautiful work that has been done by Alberta and Feigenson in the context of memory and chunking, but not in this context. So there is a lot of work that could be done here to figure out what these operations are in a potential language of thought. Already, so this is where I wanted to get. As you saw, I on purpose avoided to talk about the hard stuff, which is the one that most people here do for their research. So let me live for a moment in this dream that I am right, and the right way to just ask questions about what makes us different from other animals is to figure out what we can do with sets, what operation we can do. This is not the answer, of course, is not going to be the answer, but I would claim is tiny part of the answer. And I would like to finish this talk with the quote by another important philosopher, Groucho Marx, and I would say, well, these are my principles, but if you don't like them, I have others, and I'm happy to talk to them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Luca, a lot. We can open the floor for questions. Please, what I would like to say is something that we tried to do yesterday, and for a moment, we should prioritize students, at least in the first part of this question session. So please, students, raise your hands if you have questions. Don't be afraid.
They must be afraid. They're students.
Hi.
Hi.
Great talk, thank you. I feel like there might be a little bit of a chicken and egg problem hiding in some of the studies, not all. So the ball might not be exploding, but some of the studies on grammar that we've seen earlier in the talk, one of the things that I ended up thinking about was, do we see the same kind of errors in language models because the adults are thinking about your geometric problems in language rather than assuming that that the grammar that you've created has language-like properties. So, you know, they're essentially doing what I would be doing, which is thinking, oh, this line goes here, this line goes here. So the compositionality and the error rate comes from the fact that these adults already have language and are using it.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, of course, very good question. And it's a question that I don't have a complete answer to. I want to make 2 points. Point number 1 is about how do you interpret this phenomena? And I think that there we are at home. Namely, a completely pragmatic explanation of this effect doesn't hold because it arises automatically in yourself when you are looking at the scenes and you have to represent these scenes. The other question is a question about, okay, but isn't that cheating? Because after all, when you see these scenes, you are an adult and you represent them excuse me, in this way in which with language, essentially. And I completely take the point, and I think that this is the first kind of studies. And again, I think that neuroimaging studies here, or infant studies, can tell to what extent, when you see these scenes, besides having, of course, all occipital areas, you also have involved areas that we know are used, and that is what we want to do. So I cannot have an answer for you, but I know where to look for an answer. And the infant data are the second one, as I was saying, Irene with Susan, with this kind of, let's say, adversarial research that we have been trying to do in different kind of forms. She has tried, she has this data, and we are working on it. The data are not particularly promising in young ages, but this is also a very complex design. So I want to just, try another couple of things before giving up to your principles as opposed to mine. Yeah.
More questions?
Thanks for the talk. It was fascinating. I have a question about your claim that it is really a human singularity. Because, for example, in the first studies you mentioned about the Matthias and Fosca's work, like if there is like differences between like result obtained by humans and result obtained by, let's say, non-human primates, I think we kind of observe some kind of logical operators in other non-human species. So I was just wondering if it's like really a discrete differences between these species, or
Yes.
or if we can find some language of thought in a non-human primate or other species.
Yeah, I think it's for sure we find languages of thought, and the right way to look at these things, if you believe in language of thought, which I actually am bound to believe, because I don't know where I have it, but I had one thing that I wanted to show you, but okay. If we are bound, language of thought is really like a description of an infinite set of possibilities, and then it depends very much on, what you think about it, and then, I wanted just to mention that this is the bar in front of my house, and every time that I wake up in the morning, that's what I see. So how could I not think about language of thought? And so that is, my bias. But the proper research should be done. The reason why I claim that this could be connected to human singularity is because when I look at the kind of resources that the Paris group uses to pull out what could be the underlying language, those resources intersect very much with what I find as a natural explanation of this phenomena. And we also know, by analogy, that those resources don't seem to be natural in animals, who certainly will have a lot of ability to reason. I don't know about this particular kind of cases, and I think there is literature to be done there. But by using the fact that the kind of tools that I need in order to explain this kind of results are the same that we know that in the literature, like the Sablé-Meyer and colleagues, don't seem to be used by animals, this is my, let's say, default assumption, ready to give it up. Yeah.
My question is, should the evidence presented for infancy be interpreted as...
Sorry, I cannot locate. Aha, good, great. Okay, thank you.
Should the evidence presented for infancy be interpreted as support for adult-like reasoning abilities, or should this be interpreted as, say, something like proto-reasoning operating over iconic representations? And should the logical reasoning...
You paid him, tell the truth. Well, this is a long story, and I would tend to say that at least for this part, we are pretty sure that iconic representations are not sufficient. That doesn't necessarily mean that these are a language of thought with the operators that I think they are. But the reason why they're not sufficient is, number one, is that, as I was suggesting, it looks like the same kind of template of reasoning. You find it with these like iconic-like representation, but also when you use things like language acquisition, that's why I use the mutual exclusivity case, they seem to involve the same kind of machinery, and that is really difficult to explain only in terms of iconic representation. Number two, there are predictions in the iconic, I mean, we want to say what is iconic. So one way in which this has been played in the literature very well is by Brian Lehigh, Susan Carey, saying, well, the question is, what is a representation of an unknown? That's what I want people to concede to me. Is there something like there is an X such that I don't know what it is? Yeah? And they say, well, this representation does not exist. The representation really, anytime that you have a point of separation, you bet that, oh, it's an apple, it's a pear. Well, I don't know. You never go to the I don't know. You just take one route, one single simulation, one iconic representation, right? This has consequences. because it would predict some sort of bimodal distribution in the responses that we find at the moment of what we call the logical representation, and we do not find this distribution in infants or in adults. It's a complex question because we want to prove that there is no such distribution. So statistically, that requires a little work. But I would tend to say that the fact that this looks like it appears in many kind of different contexts, like Erno Teglas and Nicolò Arlotti have shown, the fact that it appears also in word acquisition, the fact that the distribution of these values is not bimodal, the fact that the brain representation in infants suggests that what is involved are areas that I don't know if they can be mapped with iconic representation. We don't know, but they are not naturally being mappable there. Well, it's all like inductive evidence that we might sort of exclude this. Again, this doesn't mean that we are claiming that infants at this age, they have a quote-unquote full or they have a full not. I don't think they go through a negation process, actually. So there is a lot of things to be said with respect to the role of language in transforming this kind of reactions into something that Susan Curry would describe integrated in a compositional system. There is lots to be done, but I would tend to say at the first pass that neither my maybe story nor the iconic representation story is sufficient to account for the data.
Thank you.
More questions?
Hi, Luca. Thank you for the talk. I have a question about an aspect of your data that I don't think you've said much about, which is the developmental story. If I'm correct, there are quite a number of your results that don't work in the younger infants, that work in older, and I'm wondering what you make of that. So do you think it's something about working memory?
Yeah, well, the results that I showed here, I think they all work at the age we tested. So we didn't go down below 12 months for reasons which have to do with basically the literature of reference. And so from that point of view, I would tend to say that there is not much of a developmental story. There is a story to be told, which I do not have, and that's why I ignored, I took the power of the microphone to ignore the things that I don't want to talk about. But I have to account of why, when you do an action, you make, I mean, kids at 3 years seems not to have what I claim that 12 months old have in these action tasks. My tasks are not action tasks, they are like passive exposure tasks. So there might be something very different with respect to having a mental representation of what the situation is and deciding what to do on the basis of this mental representation. So I don't know, this is sort of what I think right now. So in this part, no. There are data that actually we do not really have data except for this ball stuff that Irene Canudas tries, and for the moment we don't find clear results. These are difficult tasks for kids to begin with. So I would tend to say what we are doing here is pretty safe. In fact, our project is to try with newborns, and we'll see there. I think it's possible. There are new techniques and new abilities that have been shown by, for example, the group of Luca Surian for moral reasoning that suggests that even newborn are able to understand an ongoing scene. That's what we really need to. So there has been considerable improvement in the ability to pull out information from very young infants. We have the prediction. We'll try.
Thank you. More questions?
I finally found the position which I can see. Good, I don't move. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the talk and the data. I was wondering about the exploding smileys and partly about the origin, but more like the architecture of these systems. So given that this effect disappeared when it was just physical motion, do you think that there's a separate module for a language of thought, or which is triggered then by accidentally or on purpose by some kind of social input? Or this is somehow coming from a social origin, or this is how we navigate the social world. So what is this dedicated for, and how are these systems related? Is it just a byproduct of the design, or it's part of it?
Yes. Very simple question. So I would tend to say that the system is there to do what we want to do, as yesterday Lisa Feigens was saying, to understand, to gather knowledge, to know things about the world, to know things about the others, because we are control freaks. And that helps us in understanding, in making scientific questions, which is something that no other species have done. So I think that I think it's really difficult to describe this as a module. It's some sort of a structure that underlines the thing that you can think. Now, what happens with the fact that in certain kind of cases we can elicit it, in another kind of cases we don't seem to be able to elicit it? I try to give a response, very mild, which is, well, we do have all these reasoning systems that have been evolutionary selected, that are shared among species, that are really useful in many cases. They take priority. So one of the difficult part of this work that Irene did, and we presented 4 experiments, she did many, is really to push people out of interpreting this as a physical phenomenon. Once you are in this, you are not going to see the generality of what you are going to be presented. And it is possible that infants are unable to do this. Even if they had the resources, this uses some sort of physicality, and this can really inhibit the kind of reasoning you can do. So the way I see it is not that there is an extra module on top of it. I don't think that you can really talk about thinking as a module per se. I think there is a system of representation that has to be reasonably general. Sometimes it is, if we are right, for example, forget about the balls, but take the standard case of the 2 objects out of which one is unknown. Kids seem to be doing what we predict they would be doing if they reason the way we think they reason, okay? So it's not really necessary that you use that is available only for social phenomena. It definitely is helped by the fact that you put inside some social relation, but the way I understand it is that, well, if you are so animacy, for example, when you have an animate object, you don't use naive physics. Now you imagine that naive physics is very strong. Well, then if you can use it, you use it. It makes sense, right? So I see it like a race between different kinds of representations that are computed between different, and then on top of this race, there is this system that could be activated or not. For example, if you are drunk, it's very difficult. Attention counts. There are lots of things that count, right? And so I think that's the proper way to take a look at this data. Yeah.
Thank you. I had a very similar question to the previous one. So are you saying that some representations are easier to be fed into the system, right? So I'm not sure what you meant by you have to inhibit the physical cognition.
Yeah, well...
Are you saying that on this representation it's harder to apply these processes, while if you have some, if the social world or social reasoning invites a kind of more abstract kind of thinking or different kind of representation, more abstract representations in contrast to iconic ones, and then it's easier to observe this phenomena? Yeah,
I'm not saying, well, I'm saying essentially that like hunger takes priority over morality and decency, so the physical reasoning takes priority over many other kinds of systems. So it can mask the fact that you can do other things, and for good reasons, because this is more expensive, and so that's the one. And the fact about the social domain, to me, is only for the moment operational. I know that this is the best bet that we have to just switch kind of reasoning by not driving people into this low-level kind of cues that we know that the physical reasoning is sensitive to, like, for example, trajectories, speed, collisions, and something like that. Then if you ask me, well, but why? Well, one of the reasons I think that, yes, indeed, when you have a social situation, so look at the predicates that you use when you describe a theory of mind. You are going to see that these predicates are very much more powerful than the predicates that you use to describe a physical phenomenon. So I think that you are sort of more naturally led, even with errors, like the generic kind of thing that we said yesterday, to think on a social phenomenon by using generalizations. Yes?
We have time for 2 more short questions.
Thanks, Luca. So I was wondering, following up on some of those last ones, you said at some point, well, there's a big language of thought and smaller ones. If you don't have a general universal unimodal code, then it's really hard for me to understand what the big picture is supposed to be. Are you going to have just modules for specific domain, for domain-specific things, or you have to be committed to this in some way?
We are on the same board completely. That what I was trying to describe are some kind of concepts that I think they have not been appreciated for their importance because they were left to the linguists, which is a bad crew that leads you into these very complicated things with lots of systems and so on. So yeah, you need to really have like a good stomach to just swallow this kind of thing. So that's why we work with Gennaro Chierchia, because we'll leave to him this part. And so, so I'm not saying there is another module. I am actually saying that this is the general module. But if you want to characterize it in the very same sense in which people, Susan was talking about, we want to characterize the format of the representations, assuming that this module exists, and then we can discuss. But I think it's close to incomprehensible that no such things exist. Okay. Then there are concepts that are not natural in logic as we study, like, for example, the closure operation, these groupitizing and so on, that seem to appear in different kinds of areas. And I am saying, well, this can be part of the explanation of why this language of thought that we have has properties that do not seem to be shared with other animals. Maybe we really are. This was an idea that Piaget had originally, that some of the important concepts to understand reasoning are sets and operations over set. He was wrong about 14 years about when they occur, but he was not wrong about the fact that these are really important part to understand how we can actually code a complex world. So we are on the same board.
Last question. Okay, if there is no last question, there is always a last question, but that it means that it was the previous. Thank you, Luca, very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.